Jesus once stood in front of a crowd and called the most respected religious men in the country actors. That's what the word means. Hypocrites. It's a Greek stage term. It means someone performing a part that isn't really theirs. And he wasn't pointing at criminals. He was pointing at the men who prayed the loudest, the longest, and the most publicly on purpose, standing at the corners where the most people would walk by, timing their prayers for maximum visibility. In first century Jerusalem, that wasn't seen as arrogance. It was seen as devotion. These were the men mothers pointed to and said, "Be like him." And Jesus looked at that and called it theater. So here's the question nobody asks about this passage. If that's the scandal, if the most devout-looking men in the room were actually the least connected to God, then what does actual prayer look like? Because if performance isn't it, most of us have no idea what we're supposed to be doing instead. Jesus answers it in one sentence, 3 commands back to back. When you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. Most people read that as a location. Find a quiet room. Find advice. Slightly obvious. But the word Jesus uses for room, tamion, wasn't the average bedroom. It was the innermost storeroom of a Judean house, the room with no windows to the street. The room where you kept the things too valuable to expose to anyone walking by. Jesus isn't telling his disciples where to stand. He's telling them where to hide something valuable. Let's take the 3 commands one at a time, because each one is doing something different than it looks like it's doing. Enter your room. Ask yourself something honest. When you're exhausted, genuinely exhausted, where do you go? Not where you're supposed to go, where you actually go. You go to the one place in the house where you can stop performing, where nobody needs anything from you. Jesus is describing prayer as that place, not a task on a list, not a box to check before God stops being annoyed with you, a resting place. And that distinction matters more than it sounds like it does, because most people don't pray like they're entering rest. They pray like they're clocking in. They start already thinking about being finished. And if you're already thinking about the exit before you've walked through the door, you were never really in the room to begin with. Shut your door. Here's what nobody tells you about this part. The moment you decide to pray is the exact moment your mind decides to remember everything else. The unlocked door, the unanswered text, the thing you forgot on Tuesday that suddenly feels urgent on your knees. That's not an accident. And it's not just distraction. It's resistance. Something in you, or something outside you, does not want that door closed. Shutting the door isn't just quieting a room. It's a decision to stop letting your attention live in 10 places at once. Some of the earliest Christians who wrote about prayer described warming up before it. A psalm, a line of scripture, a moment of just arriving before saying a single request out loud. Because a scattered heart doesn't become focused the second your knees hit the floor. It has to be gathered first. And here's the strange part. The distractions themselves aren't always the enemy of prayer. Sometimes they're raw material for it. A name pops into your head uninvited. That's not always static. Sometimes that's a person who needed to be prayed for, and your mind just told you before you asked. Pray to your Father who is in secret. This is the line that quietly rewrites everything. Because Jesus doesn't say, pray to the God who is far away, or the God who is watching from a distance, keeping score. He says the God who is in secret, hidden the same way your prayer is hidden, behind the same closed door, not observing the room from outside it, already inside it. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, and the way the good stuff usually does. If God is already in the room, then the performance in the street was never actually for him. It never reached him. The men praying loudly on the corners weren't broadcasting to heaven. They were broadcasting to each other, which means the scandal in this passage isn't really about hypocrisy at all. It's about location. You can say all the right words, in all the right posture, facing all the right direction, and still never actually be in the room with God, if the room was never the point. So what does actually being in the room look like? Some of the earliest fathers described entering prayer not as reciting requests, but as stepping into scenes, standing in their minds at the well where Jesus spoke with the Samaritan woman, watching her face change from suspicion to hope, then speaking from there, standing at the foot of a cross they weren't present for 2,000 years ago, and speaking from there instead. Not performance, not vague repetition. A conversation with someone they'd chosen to actually be present with. Even memorized prayers, prayed that way. Stop being recitation. Many rise against me. Stops being an ancient line about an ancient enemy, and starts being your Tuesday, your fear, your inbox. Spoken to someone who is, according to Jesus' own words, already in the room. So the real question this passage leaves behind isn't how long should I pray or what room should I use? Jesus already answered those. The real question is this: for every prayer you've ever finished and immediately forgotten the moment you said it, were you actually in the room? Or were you standing at the corner the whole time, saying the right words to an audience that was never God at all?